Tell me if you've run into this problem before. You're working on building out a site and you need to add in some custom functionality like a select box or maybe a date picker. So you go ahead and you find a component that does that online. And that's obviously the best way to do it because building out your own date picker from scratch takes a ton of work and has a ton of accessibility problems you would have to deal with. So going with something pre-built is definitely the way to go. But as soon as you implement it into your site, you realize, okay, it's working great, but it doesn't quite look like the rest of my site. I have a very specific design I want to follow. So you try and tweak it and tweak it and tweak it, but it just never looks quite right. That's because these components that are off the shelf, they're not really meant to go with your specific design system. They're just meant to be generally good looking and useful across most designs. But that's not what you want. You want it to be specific to what you're working in. Up until now, there's really been no good way to solve this problem. You just kind of have to deal with something being a little bit off. But recently, there's been a lot of uptick in things called unstyled component libraries that give you all the benefits of using a library that has all of these features baked into it, but you can make it customized to exactly what you want it to look like. In this video, I'm going to be covering the different types of unstyled component libraries and comparing them to the more traditional styled component libraries. So if you've ever been frustrated by what I talked about at the beginning of this video, just make sure you stick around till the end because you're going to love what I'm going to show you. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name's Kyle and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. And with this video, hopefully I can make your dream project look a little bit better. Now, if you're used to component libraries, you're probably used to libraries like Bootstrap, Chakra UI, Material UI, Mantine, or maybe even single off components like the React Select component. And these are really great for handling pre-styled stuff. So like with Bootstrap, for example, you just have all these pre-styled components that require almost no work from you. And if you don't care as much about specific design of your site, these pre-styled components are really good. And some of them like Chakra even have a little bit more customization baked into them. But one of the biggest problems with these types of styled component libraries is you're stuck with the styles that they give you, and modifying it, especially if you want to modify it heavily, is very difficult and it becomes almost more work than just writing it custom from scratch. The only nice thing that these libraries do is they handle certain things that are really difficult. For example, React Select handles creating custom select boxes, which is very difficult to do inside of just normal JavaScript, React, or whatever you're using. The reason doing this is so difficult is not only because the actual code you need to write to create a custom select box is quite a lot, but also making sure you're properly handling all the accessibility and ARIA attributes that you need to make sure that it is accessible for everyone that accesses your site is very, very difficult, which is why you use libraries like the React Select library, because it has hundreds or even thousands of hours that have went into making sure that this is accessible. So up until this point, we've really only had a few options. Option one is just deal with the default select box. Obviously, that's a terrible option. Option two is to go with something like React Select to get you a custom select box, but it's not going to be styled perfectly. And option three is to work at a multi-billion-dollar company where they have enough engineers and resources that they can just create their own select box, and it doesn't matter how much time or money they spend because they essentially have infinite time and money. Now, for us normal developers, obviously option one sucks, option three is impossible, so we pretty much always go with option two and just deal with, having the styles not being exactly what you want. But now with these unstyled component libraries, we can actually get the best of both worlds. We can make it styled exactly like we want, and we can make sure that we get all of the amazing ARIA features and accessibility features we would get with something like the React Select library. Now, there are two different types of unstyled component libraries that I want to talk about. There's going to be the hook-based version or the more primitive version, and then there's going to be the component-based version. And it doesn't really matter what library or framework you're using. In my case, I'm going to be referring to everything in React. That's why I said hooks, for example. But if you're using something like Vue or Angular, there may be different libraries to do this exact same thing. So to look at that first lower level kind of hook version, I want to look at the React ARIA library. This is a library that is actually managed by Adobe, so it's got a pretty big company behind it, and it has tons of different components for making sure you handle everything related to accessibility. And they're all built around hooks inside of React. So if we come down here, you can see they have a bunch of components, things like buttons, toggle buttons, pickers, select boxes, all these kinds of things that you want to have in a normal application. One of the things that they have really good is like a date picker or a date range picker. Like these are very difficult to write out on your own. Trust me, I've done it. It's not fun and mine was terrible compared to these. So these are really, really nice. But the thing that's interesting about these, if we just click on this date picker, for example, is you'll notice if we scroll down here a little ways to where they have a code example, the way this works is you just have a single hook or maybe multiple hooks depending on how complex this is. A date picker is fairly complex, so you can see that we have this use date picker hook. and it returns to us essentially a bunch of different properties that just give us the props for that component. If we look at something a little bit simpler, let's look at a button, for example. If we scroll all the way down here, you can see we call this use button hook. We pass in some properties and stuff, and then it'll give us the button props that we need. And we just add those button props to whatever component we want. In our case, we add it to this button right here. What this does is these button props contain all of the different ARIA attributes that you need based on if the button is pressed, based on if the date picker is open, closed, all those different things are all handled by this button props, and you just pass it along. So all of that accessibility stuff is taken care of for you immediately, which is really great since you don't have to handle that yourself. The other really interesting thing about this is it doesn't apply any styles at all. By default, all of your styles are completely empty and there's nothing at all being styled, which is why you have, a really basic button here, for example. Now you can go as far as you want to style it out to look exactly like you want. If I go over here, this is actually an example of the date picker. And if I just move my camera out of the way real quick, you can see when I open this date picker up, it's a really good looking date picker. It has everything you would expect out of a date picker, for example, and they're just styling it using Tailwind CSS to give it all these really cool styles. But all of the actual code inside of here is essentially just using all of those different hooks. As you can see, we have that use date picker hook, use date picker state, and it's just giving us the props to make sure it properly handles everything related to area. So if we just open this up and I just, inspect this, you can kind of see what I'm talking about. If we just make sure we choose, for example, this element here, you can see that there are going to be a bunch of different area attributes and so on applied to this element. Let me just try this again real quick. Select inside of here. There we go. And we just expand this. You can see that the role, it has a role already. We have area attributes all over this thing, tons of different area attributes, and making sure you handle all those different area attributes and all the different input modes and roles and all of that on your own, it's pretty much impossible to be an expert in that. So having these libraries that take care of all that for you and just leave you with the styling is really great. Now, another example of a library similar to this is going to be the Downshift library. This is by Kent C. Dodds. Just move my camera back over here again. This library only handles three things. We have combo boxes, multi-select boxes, and selects. So it's really just for that like select and autocomplete kind of system, but it's very similar. You have a hook essentially. If I find here, you can see we have the use select hook, and it gives us all the same things like the props as well as like the selected item that's being selected. So if you want really low level access to be able to configure exactly what you want to, you can write out all of your own HTML, it doesn't matter, and you just kind of hook up, okay, this is my label, I'll add the label props to it, and so on. It doesn't matter what your HTML looks like, you can make it whatever you want. These types of libraries are going to be great if you really just need extreme customization, but it does require a considerable amount of upfront work just to be able to hook up these different hooks to your different components and different HTML. Another example here is the base UI. This is actually from Material UI. They essentially took what Material UI is built on top of and they broke it out into its own library. And this library is really interesting because if we look at the components here, let's just select the button, they actually have a component API and a hooks API. So you get that really low level hooks if you want to. You can see we have that use button hook. But they also have a component API. And this component API still has absolutely no styles being applied to it at all, but it gives you a little bit easier way to work with it because it has all of the HTML baked into it. So if you try to use something a little bit more complex, like a select, for example, instead of having to use the actual hook for it, so if we just take a quick second and we look at the demos here, for example, and we actually look at the actual code for this, you can see that inside of here, they're using these different selects. If we just get all the way down to the actual code, you can see here that they have these select elements, for example, select like this, as opposed to using something like the actual use select hook. They're using a select component. It gives you the exact same functionality as using the hook, but it may be a little bit easier since you don't need to write all of the HTML from scratch. Now, if we look over here, you can see that the React ARIA library also has a components version you can use instead of the hooks version if you want. And there's actually a ton of options that are in this space where they have unstyled components. The hook space is kind of small. There's not many libraries that do it. But as you can see here, we have Radix, and this has a ton of different options. I actually really like this one. And if we look, for example, at the documentation here, you can see like a checkbox, for example, to create your own checkbox just like this is rather straightforward. I actually have an example of what the code looks like to do that. I'll just bring it over here. You can see that I have a simple custom checkbox component. I'm passing in a label. I can pass whatever I want in here as well. This is just a very simple example. As you can see, I have a checkbox root and a checkbox indicator, and in here I just have a check symbol. So if we look at the actual version of this code that's running, you can see right now I have no styles at all being applied. This is just the default what you get. And you can see here is my checkbox. It's currently rendering out as a button. And if I inspect this, you can see that we have a bunch of different area attributes for if it's checked or not, the different role. For example, this is a button, but it's being a role of a checkbox, and all of those different things. Now, if I want to, I can apply some styles. I just have some really simple CSS styles in here that give me all the styles I want. And now you can see I have this checkbox with all of these different custom styles being applied to it. And the great thing is since there was no styles by default at all, it was just a plain HTML button, I can do whatever I want to style it exactly as I want, and I don't have to worry about overriding or conflicting with any of the existing styles. Now, in my opinion, these libraries that kind of are in the middle zone where they aren't quite as low level as the hooks, but they aren't fully styled, they're just components with no styles. This is kind of the sweet spot that I like to live in because it's not quite as much work as using a super low level library like the Downshift library here or the React Aria library, but it still has all of the customization that those libraries have. You just don't get as much control over the actual HTML that you're rendering because it's baked into these different components. Now, there are tons of libraries that do this. Headless UI is another one that's really popular. This one is kind of built around Tailwind. The people that made Tailwind made this library, so if you use Tailwind, this is a really easy one to slot into Tailwind. Reach UI is another alternative, and there are other options out there just like this, but in my opinion, these are some of the bigger names out there in that space. Now, if you are going to go with one of these libraries, I highly recommend what you do is you create essentially a custom component. In my case, I've created this My Checkbox component, and I wrapped all my logic for creating a custom checkbox, all the styling and everything into this one thing. So now anywhere in my code that I want a checkbox, I can just say My Checkbox, pass it along whatever props I want, and I have that custom styled checkbox. And if I want to change the styles for it, I can just go into this component or whatever CSS file I did to create those styles, and I can make those changes right there. So if you are going to do this, it's really great for creating your very own component library, essentially. So instead of being stuck with Bootstrap or Material UI, you have your own component library that conforms exactly to the standards you need. Now, on a really small project, it may not make sense to do this level of customization, but if you care about design or the style of your site, this is definitely a must-do. Or if you're on a medium to larger scale project, having your own design system is actually really great since it makes working on a larger team easier. And when you need to make changes to the design system, you own it and you can easily make those changes without having to worry about updates to the library or conflicts with the library that you're using. Hopefully this video has gotten you excited to create your very own design system, and if it did, I highly recommend using Tailwind because it's great for creating these types of design systems. And if you're interested in learning Tailwind, you're definitely going to want to watch this video over here where I tell you how not to waste your time learning Tailwind. With that said, thank you very much for watching and have a good day.